Hi, everyone, and welcome to this edition of Judgment Day, the podcast slash webcast or webcast slash podcast, whatever you like, where I go over with you some of the important judgments and rulings that have come from all the courts across Canada, not only that have been released, but the judgments that we're waiting for, and of course, the actions that are going into court and what they could mean. And one of the reasons that I just wanted to make sure that we did this is because those judgments, especially, by the way, judgments that come from the Supreme Court of Canada, have a great effect on our lives because it's judges or courts of appeal, judges who interpret the laws and make decisions. And those decisions, of course, will determine how we may even live our lives. And it's always very important to understand the reasons why judges do and say what they say. So we're going to get behind the judgments. We'll talk to people. And of course, in all areas of the law, whether it's criminal, employment, family, civil litigation, whatever it is, important judgments, we're going to try and get to you in this show coming to you. And we'll try and make it as timely as we can, by the way. As you know, a lot of times we're waiting for important judgments that come down. And if we can, depending on how our friend Toronto Mike can get us up there and running, we'll try and do things as quickly as possible. Okay, so what to talk about today in this episode? Well, it's pretty timely right now. We're at the anniversary of a very terrible thing to celebrate. And that, of course, is the pandemic. And the pandemic has had an effect on all areas of everyone's life around the world. Here in Canada, it's had an effect on the legal system. It's been quite incredible in many ways. Yours truly has never sat in a office in his or her basement practicing law, but that's what I've been doing for the last 12 months. In the summertime, luckily be able to go outside. And how I've been able to do it is because the justice system has had to adapt. And we now have Zoom hearings. We have Zoom trials. We are online all the time. All the paper, lots of paper. I still have lots of paper, but the thousands of pages of paper now get filed digitally. And so in many ways, from the legal justice system point of view, the pandemic inadvertently has made some very good strides. We're in the 21st century or getting there. But even more interestingly, have been the rulings that have come out over the last year as they relate to the pandemic. So why don't we talk a little bit about that? Because there has been a lot of different areas of law that have been affected. Now, for example, employment law. We could do about 2 or 3 shows on that alone of what's happened in the last 12 months, people losing their job, being laid off, how CERB has interacted with all that, and a lot of cases going to court. Family law we've really seen cases that have been so important for couples who are in these struggles of access to their children during the pandemic. And you may remember back in September when online learning was sort of now going to spread into in-school learning, and a lot of couples having different views on this. One side would say, I want my child to be safe, only online. The other partner going, no, we got to get them into school for all the reasons, so they have a little bit of socialization. So not surprisingly, the courts were getting filled with these emergency applications. And a lot of judges were making decisions saying, look, the experts, the government, says it's okay. They've been relying on their scientific experts, so we're not going to interfere, and we're going to say it's okay for children to go back to school. There's a lot of cases that judges were making comments on that. Now, just as an aside, talk about the experts. There's been a lot of course, criticism of how many, certainly the politicians, and how they've treated the pandemic from the beginning to now, but that's what the courts will go by. They'll always defer to what the government says is the best policy, et cetera, unless it somehow is in contravention of the law. And that's the interesting thing. And that's how we see how these judgments become very important. Now, what's been really interesting from a court litigation judgment point of view through the pandemic has been all of the cases dealing with people that didn't want to comply or allegedly breached the new regulations that came out because of the pandemic. And you all know what I mean. Social distancing and groups of people. How many people can be in one room? How many people can congregate in one area? What can be open or not open? What's considered an essential service? These are all things that came out. These are all new laws, new regulations. And people over the last year have had a lot of issues with them. We know that. And they bring, and what people do, what groups do, and people that bring applications to court. So, for example, before I get into what some of the cases have already dealt with, the Canadian Constitution Foundation is launching a legal challenge about the federal quarantine hotel policy. I mean, think about that hotel policy that the government finally came out with after all of that time. You may remember the last month requiring travelers who enter Canada to take a COVID test and then quarantine at a government approved hotel until they receive the results. And then travelers have to pay out of pocket for those hotels, which costs over $2,000 per traveler. Well, the Canadian Constitution Foundation, they've launched a legal challenge. They say that that policy is unconstitutional. They say it's unjustifiable under the Canadian Charter, which is the protected right to enter Canada. Now, interestingly, depending on how long it takes to get to court, assuming the pandemic is still on, the court is going to deal with that and determine. And how important is, when you see these types of challenges, this is why I've tried to say why these decisions become important. Because if a court agrees with the Canadian Constitution Foundation when this application is heard and says, yeah, that policy is unconstitutional, it has huge ramifications, of course, of what the government may or may not do. Now, this is all, assuming and supposition, but that's why these types of cases in the context, while we're right in this pandemic, become really important. We see this in the freedom of religion aspect. And as you probably know, part of the regulations here in Ontario, across the country, deal with how many people can be in a church or synagogue or any prayer of worship, any house of worship, and limiting the amount of people. Well, there's you may recall the case that an Alberta man by the name of Coates, James Coates, who was charged with violating the Alberta Public Health Act. And basically, he is a pastor, and he did not want to not congregate. He felt that he had a right to be able to do what he wanted to do. And I just reading from his affidavit, he said when he was faced with a conflict between the mandate of Scripture and the mandates of government as represented by the orders out in Alberta, that he feels the mandate of Scriptures should prevail. And that's why he was charged with breaching those regulations. And then he got charged. He was held in custody, tried to get his bail varied. And what the court said there out in Alberta was that despite his strongly held religious beliefs, and freedom of religion is a constitutionally protected right in this country, as you know, the judge there says that he's still subject to the rule of law. And that has an overarching importance. And the court did not agree with his argument, and he's still held in custody. So you can see that that particular, even somebody saying this is a religion, this is something I need to do, and the courts are saying no. You got to balance this. We're in a pandemic now. Interestingly, and this always happens with cases, out in Quebec, a superior court there ruled in favor of a Hasidic Jewish community on limits to religious gatherings. So we had a totally different ruling. The court there said that the restrictions in Quebec on indoor religious gatherings in Montreal, which only allowed a maximum, I think it was 10 people, was not constitutional, and basically allowed and settled this legal battle that was taking place between the Quebec Council of Hasidic Jews and several Jewish organizations. And they argued 10-person limit per synagogue, unacceptable, violated freedom of religion. And you sit back and you say, okay, two provinces, two different types of rulings, but that's what happens. And in these types of situations. Now, here in Ontario, we had a case, you may remember hearing the name Adam Skelly. Adam Skelly owns Adamson Barbecue in Etobicoke, and police were called to his place last November, and he openly defied the lockdown measures. And we've had these types of protests, if you will. And he felt that he should be allowed to have in-person dining. And you may remember seeing the visuals of all these people outside his restaurant, many of them without masks on, etc. And he got charged both criminally, non-criminally, trespassing, obstructing police, violating the indoor dining rules, etc. And interestingly, the city of Toronto's now trying to get about $187,000 from him, saying that that's what they spent enforcing the rules and the regulations to try and stop him from doing what they said was a breach of the law. So, and again, just this past week in Montreal, there was some sort of protest there where thousands of people are marching down the street in defiance of the regulations with respect to how many people can congregate. So we've seen a lot of that. Now, what has it resulted in? Well, people have been fined. Some people getting instantaneous fines, but there was a recent article that said here in Ontario, only 18% of all COVID-19 related charges since a year ago in March have been dealt with by the justice system. Only 18%. And hundreds of thousands of dollars are out there in unpaid fines that some of them are now over a year in the making. And another incredible statistic, only 990 of the 5,500 charges laid since March of 2020 have been dealt with. And so when you start talking about the law and the pandemic, and you start seeing this happening to people, you say, okay, yeah, we got to give the government, we're all in this together. We understand that's the rule of law, if you will. Maybe we have to follow it, but it's not being enforced in the way that, well, if somebody's being fined and it's not being collected, or even more importantly, due process. Because if somebody gets charged, they are allowed to fight this, of course. And a lot of people still are not even making it to the court with their charges. And so, again, the argument would be, well, at least if you have these laws in the context of a pandemic, the courts can deal with them. It'll act as a deterrent to other people. But that, of course, is a huge argument as to whether or not that is really happening. So that's the type of thing that we've been seeing through the pandemic. And the courts are having to deal with these various issues. And we've had other cases as well, totally outside that context of religion or violating the rules with respect to openings. There's also been arguments in courts about just unfairness about COVID laws. We had a case where an Ontario judge dismissed a bid by Canadian Appliance Source, big appliance company. They wanted to be considered a hardware store so they too can be deemed an essential service. So you see how it works. The word hardware store allowed companies like the big box stores to stay open. Or certainly a lot of the classic hardware stores to stay open. They wanted to argue, based on the word hardware, they should also, because they sell appliances that are made of hardware. Well, Justice Perel didn't buy the argument and dismissed their application. And of course, they spent the money to go to court to argue this because of all the money that they were losing because they couldn't open. So these are the types of cases that have been going in and out of the courts through the last 12 months. And I'm sure we're going to see more of these COVID-related judgments until some point. I'm going to assume that when this pandemic is over, God willing, many of these cases, especially people being charged, will still find themselves in court. All right. As I told you earlier, we're going to be talking about all sorts of judgments from one end of the country to the other, because as you saw when I showed you Alberta and Quebec, sometimes provinces do things a little differently when it comes to the enforcement. Let's head out to British Columbia right now, because in BC, there is a very big case that's taking place out there. It has sort of a little bit of a COVID connection, but more so in the fact that it's a big extradition case. And of course, this is the case of Wanzhou Meng, who of course is the chief financial officer, deputy chairwoman of the Chinese technological company Huawei, wanted in the US on fraud-related charges. And who better, who's popped into your screen right now to talk about this and other things out in British Columbia, one of British Columbia's most competent, how do you like that? I found the word, competent lawyers. My former classmate at law school, Michael Shapray, Stern. Welcome, Michael.
How are you?
How are you, sir?
Pretty good. How you doing?
You know, I've said this before and I'll say it again. People, when I say that you are a classmate of mine, they look at you and they look at me and they say, but Shapray looks way older than Honickman. How can that be? Great joke, eh? It works every time.
It never gets tired, Lorne. It never gets tired.
How are you, my friend?
We're doing all right out here. We're still, month 12 or 13 of a never-ending pandemic, but
yeah,
we hopefully can see the end of it soon.
I was just talking before you came on about how the courts across the country are dealing with these cases specifically to the pandemic, people getting charged, people getting fined, but not here in Ontario, they're not collecting a lot of money from it, but still,
we have a few of those cases. I just had someone fined over $2,000 for having 3 people in his home. Just filed a dispute. I think they say about 5% of the fines have been collected, and the rest of them can be disputed like a traffic ticket. So right. The cost of the system to try and collect, if everybody challenges this, is going to be prohibitive.
Unbelievable. All right, can we talk about this extradition hearing of Wanzhou Meng? And today, as we speak, she is back in court, correct?
Yeah, we just are on day 2 of what's set for about 5 weeks of hearings in front of the Associate Chief Justice on the extradition hearing and the abuse of process application. So this is timely in a sense that it's just sort of started to hit the airwaves again, and the case has revved up in the courts.
And speaking of COVID, it did become front and center in this case when she went to court recently to try and vary her bail. But first of all, let's talk about the bail. It is probably, I think you'd agree with me, one of the most stringent bails you've ever seen or I've ever heard of in this country.
Yeah, so she was released, I think it's almost 3 years ago now, on a $10 million bail. The focus of the hearing was the risk of her fleeing the jurisdiction. We often hear them talk about the primary ground, secondary ground, and bail. The primary ground is there a risk that someone's not going to comply with their conditions or could flee the jurisdiction and not show up in court? And with her wealth and her international connections, a very significant bail with $7 million in surety from a number of different people, as well as $3 million cash, electronic monitoring, a curfew, and most interestingly, privately paid security 24/7
Unbelievable.
that she offered to pay for herself to give the court some sense of security that she would not abscond. And that was the bail order that she recently tried to vary.
And one of the reasons that she put forward that her bail should be varied was because of the effects of COVID-19. And again, we see it coming into a case. And basically, she said that her current bail conditions posed an unacceptable risk to her health and safety. What was the argument?
Well, the issue there is that she's on a curfew at night and then she's in her house, obviously, but she really has no restrictions on where she goes during the day, even on the electronic monitoring and with the security. So we've heard that she's had local department stores shut down for private shopping and has been able to go to restaurants and out and about. We've been a little less locked down in British Columbia than you have been in Ontario and other parts of the country. And the argument was that by putting herself in cars and in the sort of close confined spaces with her security detail for which she's paying, that was putting her and her family at greater risk of contracting COVID. And that was the foundation for the application.
Right. And I when I read the judgment, the judge said that when she rides in vehicles, she has to be with other employees, and the complaints that a lot of times they weren't wearing masks, and that of course you listen, anybody can understand if you got in a car with somebody not wearing a mask, but again, that wasn't compelling enough for the court to change anything.
No, and ultimately the court heard from a few witnesses. They heard from her husband. They heard from the security detail, which fascinatingly, the evidence there was that they did not want to be removed from a 24/7 security detail because of the impact on their financial position as a security company. I mean, really quite interesting evidence.
So Michael, are we now starting today? Are we now in for the next couple of weeks into the full hearing now?
We're into a full hearing on abuse of process, the nature of her arrest when she came in, the nature of the allegations in the US as to whether or not they can make out that there was any loss at all. And essentially, it's a large abuse of process application being brought by her defense team, looking at a number of prongs of the investigation and the arrest to try and convince a judge that the extradition warrant should be thrown out, or the extradition hearing should be unsuccessful.
And every time I hear anything about her case, I always think about, as we refer now to the two Michaels in China. And we did get word very recently, or at least if I understand, that maybe there's now going to be process there and they're going to finally get a trial there.
Well, I mean, we've heard recently that they will likely get a trial soon. And interestingly, that announcement came on the eve of Miss Meng's major court proceedings starting this week in Vancouver. We don't know what that trial is going to look like. We don't know what process will be involved. There's obviously a great deal of skepticism, and we haven't seen any evidence or even a release of any suggestion of what these allegations are based upon. And of course, their arrest came shortly after Miss Meng's arrest in British Columbia and has been thought of to be a retributive type situation.
And by the way, just speaking of, I was talking off the top about how the justice system has changed because of the pandemic. You and I are in Zoom courts now.
Yeah.
Is the extradition hearing is being held? can the public get in and actually watch this?
My experience has been, I just did a 5-day trial in Supreme Court. We're not running virtual trials in British Columbia. We are doing a lot of virtual proceedings, telephone and MS Teams for pleas and bail hearings. But her case is proceeding in person. The issue of public gallery is based on which courtroom you're in, how many gallery seats are allowed to be open based on social distancing. But it is an open court.
So
So
it's actually in a court there. So
they're in the British Columbia Supreme Court in
okay.
Vancouver, and the
Okay.
lawyers are present in person. I mean, there may be people who are zooming in or MS teaming into the courtroom, but that case is an open court live hearing. I've been in hearings where I've been live for a 2-day bail hearing on a murder case. The Crown came in by phone for 2 days.
Yeah.
That's an option for people as well, and it's interesting.
It's changed a lot of ways. I haven't been inside an actual courtroom in over a year. So
that's unbelievable.
Yes, and that's the way it is. All right, I'm going to let you go, my friend. But of course, we will talk to you often here on Judgment Day. You'll get us up to date. We'll check in real soon and see about the extradition hearing and other things. I know you get very interesting rulings out in BC. People have to appreciate that it's a different world out there.
We used to think it was something, the smoke in the air, but now that that's legal across the country,
That's right. It
can't be the explanation anymore.
I used to blame it on that all the time.
I don't know what you're talking about.
All right, sir. We will talk again soon. Nice seeing you.
Okay, take care. See you soon.
See you soon. Michael Shapray from Stern Shapray out in British Columbia, and it is true. He was in my law class, but that's because I went to law school a little later. If you know my background, I always have to make these excuses. Okay. So that's going to be this edition of Judgment Day. And next, just talking to Michael and realizing, I was sort of teasing him about the cases from BC, and there are some really interesting cases, and we'll talk about that right across the country. It's very interesting, the different provinces, and of course, when the Supreme Court of Canada comes out with their judgments, some of them interesting, all of them very important to the parties involved, and many of them important to even you and me and people who aren't even involved, but at how it may affect our lives and what we do. Now, I'm not on Twitter and I'm not on Facebook. There you go, but you can get a hold of me, okay? So I have no problem. You want to send me an email, talk about things that you may want me to cover and talk about on Judgment Day, happy to do so. You get me at my law firm at Brody Thorning in Toronto, L. Honickman at btlegal.ca, L. Honickman at btlegal.ca, and I will get to your email and we will talk again. And just remember, and I'll leave you with this, you do have the ability to read these judgments, to go online and read them. Some of them are all legalese and complicated, but some of them are pretty interesting reading. And if you have any interest in any specific area of law, it's pretty accessible right now. Until next time, I'm Lorne Honickman. See you on the next Judgment Day.